What do you do with an introduction like that? It's hard to speak. My adopted son, Dan, you're a pastor. I love him. I love the family, the Smith family. His father was one of the presidents during the time that I served as the union president, so we worked together very closely. They were in Thailand at the time. And I have a great affection for Dan and for the Smith family. His mother's here today, Jean, and we're thankful for that. I cannot tell you or express to you adequately in the English language the emotions that are going through me at this time. There are times when I want to laugh and smile, and there are times when I feel like crying. The whole sweep of emotions today. Last few days, my mind has been going back to the events that took place 40 years ago and before that. And we have honored Ralph and Bee Neal, who served for many years in Southeast Asia, Cambodia, and Vietnam. They're here today. How old are you, Ralph? 87. Just a boy. Still going strong. And you need to know, folk, those of you that are here today, meeting us maybe for the first time, you're going to see a few gray-haired people walking around. Most of us that were involved in that at that time period, we're all in our 80s today. As Dan told you a little while ago, I'm 81. But God is so good, and He's blessed us. And we still have energy and strength, and we want to continue to see His work move forward. Now, I need to give you some exciting news. 4 weeks from today, Pastor Dan and I will be preaching in Saigon. And our son will be joining us. And so there will be 3 of us speaking in Saigon, and as you've read in your notes there in the sermon, in the bulletin, we'll be spending a week in Vietnam. 5 weeks from today, my son and I will be speaking in Hanoi. Can you believe that? And so we're still involved in some projects in Vietnam. I've been going to Vietnam almost every year for the last 25 years. Pastor Yao has gone with me on almost every trip. And we're looking forward to having Pastor Dan this year. And we are grateful for the way that God is blessing His work in Vietnam. It's an encouragement every time I go back and I meet with the leaders and hear how the work is moving forward. It brings a great deal of encouragement to me. But I also want to say this. What also thrills my heart is to see how God has blessed His work in this country through you people. The Vietnamese, we have many Vietnamese churches all over the North American division. And we have representatives here today from most of those churches, if not all of them. We have Frankie Lee that's come to us from Hawaii. He has a very difficult assignment, having to live and work in Hawaii. And we have others from Florida, many from Florida. And so it is such a wonderful thing for us to be able to come together, part of God's family, to worship and to fellowship and renew acquaintance. Some of us have not seen each other in 40 years. You don't recognize me. I didn't have gray hair then, but God has kept His hand over all of us, and He's blessed us, and we're grateful for that. And I want to just say a word about some of the visitors that are here today. I'll be speaking about more a little bit later on. And remember, this afternoon will be a continuation of what I'm sharing with you this morning. But I do feel there are some things that I just need to get off my heart and people that I need to say something about. You met Pastor and Mrs. Gaynor Pastor Gaynor was the chief financial officer, the treasurer of the Southeast Asia Union. He was also the vice chairman of the Saigon Adventist Hospital Board. And so very much involved in the transition when we took over the military hospital, we'll be talking about a bit today. Associated with me also is Royce and Elaine Thompson. They're seated over here. Mr. Thompson came to the Southeast Asia Union office to look after the 6 hospitals that we were operating. And of course, one of them was Saigon Hospital. And during that period of time, he worked very closely with a man by the name of Harvey Rudisill. How many of you remember Harvey Rudisill? May I see your hands? He was the manager of our hospital. His daughter is here today. They were planning on coming. Well, I was hoping that they would be here today. They were not able to make it, but his daughter is here. Bonnie, where are you? There she is. She's standing up. Bonnie, let's welcome her. Bonnie Rudisill. Then we had a number of physicians working at the Saigon Adventist Hospital. At one point in time, you might be surprised if I told you that we had nearly 50 expatriates that were a part of the Saigon Adventist Hospital when we had the contract with the U.S. government. After the ceasefire took place, the government had to find a hospital to take care of the embassy, USAID, third country nationals, and so the 3rd Field Hospital was given to the Seventh-day Adventists to operate. And so we were responsible for that. And one of the doctors that was with us for the last couple of weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, you weren't there very long. Where are you? Jim, where are you? Jim, Dr. Simpson, would you please stand? And his wife. He was one of the surgeons. And his wife. Thank you. There were 2 other doctors that were there at the very last, Dr. and Mrs. Wiseman. They were not able to come today because of their age. And Dr. Bruce Branson, who was chief of surgery at Loma Linda, he passed away a number of years ago. Now there are some others that were very closely involved. And this afternoon I'll be sharing some of those experiences with you. There are 2 people, 2 very special people that I'm going to introduce to you later on this morning. And they have played a very important role in this entire process. So I'd like to just sort of get a little idea of where everyone is from. I've just written down a few questions. How many of you left Vietnam before the month of April? May I just see your hands quickly? Do we have any? We have a few. All right. How many left on the medical evacuation flights? Only the medical evacuation flights. Were there any that left on those flights? We have several hands. Are there any here that were in Don Ross special group where the wives and the children left on an earlier flight? May I see your hands? All right. And we're sorry that Don Roth is not with us today. He passed away about 3 years ago, but he played an important role in helping to get some of the families out. Now the last question, not the last, but the next one I want to ask, how many were in the group that left in those 8 evacuation flights that took place on Friday, April 25? May I see your hands? Oh, wow. Yeah. Now, final question. How many came to the United States after the fall of Saigon? May I see your hands? Hi, Lance. By boat. How many by boat? I'm telling you, folks, they are the ones that had it difficult. And there are thousands of Vietnamese that did not survive making the boat trips. So we're thankful for those of you that were able to come out on that. There's a passage of Scripture in the Old Testament, in the book of Jeremiah, that was my promise from God that kept me and helped to sustain me during those last few days. And it's found in the book of Jeremiah, the 32nd chapter, verses 26 and 27. And I want you to be thinking about this passage as I share my experience this afternoon. Behold, the word of the Lord came unto Jeremiah, saying, Behold, I am the Lord, the God of all mankind. Is there anything too hard for me? We want to think about that and ponder that as we meet together today, because that was a promise that was so extremely important to all of us. I am the Lord, the God of all mankind. Is there anything too hard for me? Do you believe in miracles? Do you realize that most of us that are seated here today were part of a miracle? If it had not been for the intervention of God using human instruments, if it had not been for the intervention of God, many of us would not be here today worshiping together. Do you believe that? But God in His providence sees the end from the beginning and realized the importance of making it possible for His people to leave at a very critical time. The situation in the country has changed since 1975. In fact, you need to know that there's a big difference since 2008. Well, you're asking, what would be the difference between 1975 and 2008? The major difference is the fact that the Vietnamese government, the SRVN, the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, during that interval did not recognize the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And so it was very difficult for our leaders and for our workers and for our members to try to share the gospel in Vietnam. Very, very difficult. There were times when they were harassed. There were times when they were in prison. There were times when they were being intimidated. So our people, you need to know that during that period of time, our Seventh-day Adventist members were going through and leaders were going through a very difficult time. And I used to visit Vietnam regularly from 1987, 1988, right through until last year, going to Vietnam on a regular basis, primarily as my role as president of ADRA. So the Vietnamese government was very anxious to have ADRA come in and work with them, partner with them in projects throughout the country. And so I made many trips into Vietnam. We established an office, first in Saigon and then eventually in Hanoi. And so the church, through ADRA, was able to develop relationships with the government. And those relationships improved gradually over time. And we met with government leaders in Hanoi. We met with the Minister of Religions. We met with the leaders in the Foreign Affairs Ministry of the government. And we talked about the importance of the government giving recognition to the Seventh-day Adventist Church. The Seventh-day Adventist Church in Vietnam, our church, our leaders in Vietnam, over the years have made an outstanding contribution to the people of that country. And it's true today. So in 2008, on April 12, 2008, the Vietnamese government gave full recognition to the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Vietnam. Isn't that wonderful? And what a difference that has made. We're able to, our leaders and pastors are able to move around the country freely. They can hold evangelistic meetings. They can give Bible studies. They can collect offerings. There is no inhibition. There is no problem with the work today as far as the government is concerned. And one interesting little note. Last year, either this month or next month, the world president of the Seventh-day Adventist Church made a visit to Vietnam. And we talked about it, and I urged him to go. And so arrangements were made. The government said, fine. And he wanted to hold some evangelistic meetings. And they said, that's fine, but we wanted to see that, please send the manuscripts. So he sent the manuscripts. They looked it over, and they said, it's fine. So he and his wife made a visit to Saigon. And for 4 nights, the president of our world church preached to the people in Saigon. And on Sabbath morning, Pastor Wilson got into the baptistry, and he baptized himself. He baptized 35 young adults. Who would have thought this was possible? Now we're talking about the need for a church in Hanoi. Do you think that's a good idea? The population of Vietnam is 93 million today. 93 million. It's a progressive country. It's a country that is really economically becoming stronger. And about 3 or 4 years ago, we planted 2 churches in Hanoi. We sent some volunteer workers, some lay pastors, they went up there, and some pastors, and they started holding meetings, giving Bible studies. We have 2 congregations meeting in Hanoi today, 2 of them. And 5 weeks from today, I'll be preaching in one of them. My son will be preaching in the other. Now, we would have liked for Pastor Dan to have been with us in Hanoi, but you know what happened? He said, no, I cannot stay. I have to come back and preach in Garden Grove that Sabbath. So you folk wouldn't let him off for another Sabbath. If he could have stayed for another Sabbath, he could have been with us in Hanoi. But he had to come back. So he's flying back on Friday from Hanoi so he can be here on Sabbath morning. So you'll share the report with him of our visit to Vietnam. Miracles. Miracles. And out of tragedy came a miracle. On April 4, some of you will remember it, on April 4, there was a large aircraft that had been sent over by President Ford to help evacuate orphans. Hundreds and thousands of orphans were taken out of Vietnam, brought to the U.S., where they were adopted into families. And so these flights were going, and on Friday, the 4th of April, the world's largest aircraft at that time left Tan Son Nhut Airport in Saigon, headed for Guam. There was a terrible explosion right after the plane lifted off over the Gulf of Tonkin. There were scores of children that were sucked out of the plane when the doors opened. They fell to their deaths to the ocean. The pilot turned around, but the plane was just wobbling, couldn't control it. And finally, just before Tan Son Nhut Airport, he could see the runways just coming in. The plane lost airspeed, lost control, and it crashed in the rice paddy fields just short of the Tan Son Nhut airfield. It was marshy land, rice land. Vehicles could not go in. So helicopters were sent in to try to bring out the injured, ones that survived. This was a 2-storied airplane. And those that were on the lower level, most of them were killed. Those that were on the upper level, many of them survived. So the helicopters were bringing the victims out, those that had survived this terrible tragedy, were bringing them out, flying them out, flying them out, flying them out, taking them to the nearest hospital. Do you know what hospital that was? Can anyone tell me? What? Saigon Adventist Hospital. So all of those children and the pilots and the crew and those that survived were taken to the Saigon Adventist Hospital. That was on Friday afternoon and Friday evening. Those that were dead were left behind for a while they got the injured out. So our hospital staff, Dr. Simpson, you worked all Friday night, didn't you? And all day Sabbath, and Saturday night, Sunday, the doctors and the nurses, and I want to just pay tribute to the medical staff for all that they did to take care of those that survived that crash. I flew in on Sunday from Singapore, where we lived. And as my plane was making its final approach, I looked out on the right-hand side. I looked down and I could see the debris. Smoke was still billowing up from the plane because it caught into fire, broke into 3 pieces, and then into flames, burst into flames. I could still see the smoke. And I thought to myself, how could anyone have survived this? Went to the hospital, met with Nip and Yao and Lily and others that were working at the hospital to get an update on what was going on. And it was just amazing that there were survivors, but there were. Then on Monday, April the 6th, the 7th, a letter was sent to Harvey Rudisale. I have the original letter right here in my hands. And it was posted on the bulletin board, so as the staff walked by, they could see this letter. I want to read the letter to you. It was addressed to Mr. Harvey Rudisale. Dear Mr. Rudisale, I find it quite difficult to adequately express my personal gratitude and that of my people for the superb medical attention given the surviving victims of the recent air tragedy that deprived us of so many of our friends and the children that they were trying to help. But for the professionalism, the devotion, and determination of your staff, that tragedy might well have been total in its consequences. Please accept our undying thanks and our continued good wishes for your continued help to this community. Signed, gratefully, H.D. Smith, Major General, United States Army, Defense Attaché, DAO, Defense Attaché. Major General Smith. Now, I want you to remember that name because this is important. Major General Smith. You'll hear why this played a very important role if you're here this afternoon. Well, the letter was great, but the situation in the country was desperate. You remember it. You were there. People fleeing from all over trying to get into Saigon. Saigon is cordoned off with 16 divisions of the North Vietnamese military. They had the city choked off. Refugees could not even come into Saigon at that time, many of them, unless they have relatives, someone to support them. And so the country was in despair. People were concerned. It looked like the way to safety and freedom and hope and liberty was not available. Very difficult time. And during the month of April, I made 3 trips into Saigon to meet with our leaders, to meet with Pastor Yao and our mission leaders, Pastor Lehu and Pastor Famtien, and the leaders, members of our committee in the hospital. And we talked and we prayed and we met with the government officials. Now, we had taken over, at their request, the operation of the Saigon, of the 3rd Field Hospital. The military hospital was given to the Seventh-day Adventist Church, lock, stock, and barrel. All of the equipment, all the supplies were given, and it's a pretty large facility. And we accepted that with the understanding that if the time came and the situation became critical, that the government would make provisions for our key leaders to be able to leave. Because it was well known within the Viet Cong community, and certainly within our community, that there were key leaders that were sort of on a special list that the North Vietnamese government had. So their lives were in danger. They knew that. We knew it. And the government assured us that when the time comes, we will make sure that provisions will be made for you. So that's the situation that we found ourselves in. And there were 3 people. There were 3 men that I want to talk about this morning and this afternoon that you need to know that in my judgment, God used to make it possible for us to be able to leave. General Smith is one. The other one I want to talk about this afternoon, who played an extremely important role in this, was a man by the name of Johnny Johnson. Mr. Johnson had been given the assignment by the President to assist in the evacuation of high-risk Vietnamese and Americans that were still in the country. So that was his job. And planes were coming in, evacuation flights were taking place during that second and third week of April. Planes coming in and leaving every 20 or 30 minutes. One of these planes would come in, whether a C-130 or 141 coming in, and hundreds and eventually thousands of people, or Vietnamese and third country nationals and Americans that were still living in Saigon, were leaving. Now you might be surprised to know that during those last few weeks or months in Saigon, there were 6,000 Americans living in Saigon. I did not know that. Had no idea that there were that many. 6,000. So the government was very anxious to get particularly the Americans out of the country because of the danger that was looming on the horizon. The ambassador, the U.S. ambassador, got into a confrontation with the central government, the federal government. The ambassador, his name was Graham, and his view, his conviction was, in order to save the country from falling to the north, keep as many Americans in the city of Saigon. Don't take the Americans out. Keep them there. If the North attacks, and there is a loss of American lives as they attack Saigon, then the United States government will decide that they need to get back into the war, and they will join the South, and they will fight against the North. That was the ambassador's thoughts. The Pentagon, the generals, and the State Department, Dr. Kissinger, but particularly the Pentagon, the military said, no, that's foolish. We need to get the valuable assets, we need to get them out now while we can get them out without having to do it with battle going on, with a war going on. So this is the tension that existed. The ambassador saying, no, you cannot leave. The military saying, yes, we must get them out. And finally, the president had to make a decision. Who's he going to listen to, the ambassador or to his generals? And so President Ford, listening carefully to Dr. Kissinger, let's get them out as quickly as we can. And so that's the reason why those evacuation flights were authorized. But the ambassador kept insisting that they stay. The situation became so desperate between the tension between the ambassador and the Department of State that an admiral, the admiral in charge of the Pacific Fleet, there in the Gulf of Tonkin, there were 5 United States aircraft carriers alone, 5 of them, along with the other ships, waiting to assist if the time came. The admiral was asked to go into the embassy, fly into the embassy, which they did, a helicopter, and take the ambassador out, which they did. But we did not know this. We had no idea that this tension was going on until the last day or two. The last week, from the 20th of April to the 25th of April, was the most difficult week for many of us. It was the most difficult, traumatic week for me as president of the union, as the leader, chairman of the board of the hospital and the publishing house, to try to figure out what should we do? What decisions should we make? How is this all going to play out? We had no idea. We had no idea how this was all going to take care of itself. We knew what we felt needed to be done. But I received an encouraging letter before that last flight that I made into Saigon from a man by the name of Robert Pearson. That name may not ring a bell to most of you. But Robert Pearson was the president of our world church at that time. And he realized that this situation was going on. Now, he had been involved in similar situations in Africa where there was fighting taking place, and he realized the importance of making sure that the leaders were kept safe. So he wrote me a letter just a few days before I made that last trip, and he said, Ralph, if the time comes, make sure you do everything you can for our leaders whose lives would be in danger to leave. Now, there's some that felt the other way, but this was the counsel from the president. And then I received a telegram from the former secretary of the China division, a man by the name of S.J. Lee. And he sent me a telegram referring to the experiences that they went through in China in 1948 and 49 when the communists took over the entire country. And he sent me a telegram. He says, don't hesitate to take the leaders out. By all means, do everything you can to make sure that they're safe. So I had those two opinions, which helped to provide and guided me in the decisions that we were about to make. Now, on the 19th of April, we left on the 25th. On the 19th, the Friday before, 1 week before, we were in Malaysia. We had been working very hard, our staff. We were tired, we were weary, we needed a break, we needed some time away. So we had organized an opportunity for us for the union staff to go up country in Malaysia and have a retreat, to just relax a bit, to the little community of Mersing, Malaysia. Some of you may know where that is. And so we were there. We were planning on being there Sabbath, Friday and Sabbath, then coming back on Sunday to return to our normal duties on Monday. Friday afternoon, I received a telephone call from the president of the division, my boss. His name was Paul Eldridge. And he said to me, he said, Ralph, can you return to Singapore? I said, certainly I can. We're calling an emergency meeting of the division committee tonight, this evening. Please return. We need you here for this meeting because we're going to be discussing what needs to be done next in Vietnam. So I got in my car with my wife, left my children behind. The Gaynors were in Mersing, the Thompsons were in Mersing, and I drove back to Singapore. Now, there's one thing that the Seventh-day Adventist Church does not do, and that is we don't hold conference executive committees on Sabbath, do we, Gerald? Have you ever had one? No. Church board, unless it's an emergency? No. So the church doesn't operate that way. Whether it's the general conference or the division or the union or the local field, we do not have executive committee meetings during a Sabbath. Just don't do it. Now this was one taking place on the Sabbath, Friday night. And many thoughts were going through my mind. I knew we were under extreme pressure from some that were at the hospital to close it down. And the word was coming to the division. It's critical. We're getting words from the doctors. We're getting word from Dr. Rudisale, from Mr. Rudisale. He's under extreme pressure to close the hospital. And Rudisale had contacted the division and said, I need help. I need help. We need to make a decision. And so I go to the division office on Friday night. And there are the leaders gathered around the table. The president of the division then outlines what the concerns are. And so we enter into discussion. Should we authorize the hospital to close immediately? And some said, no, we can't do that. Extend it a while. Well, how long? And after a discussion for perhaps an hour, weighing the information that came from Loma Linda because of the Loma Linda doctors, Dr. Simpson and Branson, and the information we were getting from Vietnam, a decision had to be made. And so we decided that we would not make a decision to close the hospital at that point, but that I, as the chairman of the board, would go in on Sunday and assess the situation. If I needed help, then others would come and join me on Monday. So after the Sabbath, Sunday morning, packed up. I went to the airport. Pat took me to the airport. And I said, honey, I'm going up and I'm returning on Wednesday. I said, we have Southeast Asia Union College Board and a hospital board, plus a union committee on Thursday. So I'll go up on Sunday, come back on Wednesday, and be there for the meetings on Thursday, and Friday I'll return back to Saigon. But as I was saying goodbye to my wife, and as we were planning for this, she made a pretty astute observation that I really didn't pay too much attention to at that time. You remember what it was? What did you say? Did you hear that? My wife said to me, Ralph, you need to be prepared to stay to the end, knowing that within days, Saigon would probably fall. I said, no, I will come back on Wednesday and then have the meetings on Thursday, and I'll return back to Saigon on Friday. That was what I was pretty determined to do. So on Sunday, fly in. Don Roth was with me on that flight. We meet with the embassy people, we meet with the hospital administrators, we meet with the mission leaders, and the situation is just deteriorating moment by moment, hour by hour. It's just getting worse and worse and worse. Curfew had been set in. Curfew had been established there for Saigon. Then on Monday, Royce Thompson and Romy Gaynor fly in. And so now there's several of us from the Union office to assist Harvey Rudisale and to assist the leaders of the mission in making provisions. How are we going to provide the best that we can for our workers, for our leaders, for our members, those that will be remaining behind? And we didn't know at that time if anyone would be able to leave. It was a desperate time. I will never forget Monday night, April 21. Do any of you remember what happened on Monday night? There was a speech made over the television network in Vietnam by the name of a man by the name of Tu. Does that ring a bell? President what? President Tu. What happened on Monday night? Can anyone tell me? What did he do? The president of the country that night resigned. He quit. He said, I can no longer be president of this country. He says, we have been asked to fight. We have been asked to fight the North with our arms tied behind us and with no help, which was true. No help from the U.S. government. That decision had been made several years before. But the North was getting help from the Chinese and from the Russians, and so they were becoming stronger and stronger and stronger, and the South was becoming weaker and weaker and weaker. So the president resigned on Monday night. So there we are, Pastor Yao and I and others. Man, what does this mean? What does this mean? They're going to surrender? Well, the next day they elected another president. I don't know who the man was, but he lasted one day. So now we have one president on Monday, another president on Tuesday. Now we're coming to Wednesday, and they elect another president. Does anyone remember who that man was? Have you ever heard of the man, General Big Men? Yeah, General Big Men. He was elected the president, and he was the president of the South Vietnamese government when the North took Saigon. So in a matter of 4 days, we had 3 presidents. Now let me ask you a question. What kind of confidence does that give you? Think about the emotions of our Vietnamese people. Think about what was going through the minds of our people, our workers, our leaders. Consternation, worry, fret, concern. That clock isn't right. Good night. It's a good thing I looked at this. That says 20 minutes after 12. My clock says 20 minutes to 1. Which is right? That one or this one? I'm praying that that watch is correct. But I better not, because Pastor Dan says I need to quit at 1:45. I will continue the story this afternoon. We need to finish it up. It won't take long, but I need to finish the story because it's one series of miracles after another. But I want to tell you something. And I want to say this right now before we get in too far. There are 3 men, and I'm going to mention these 3 in case you don't come this afternoon, but you need to hear. The first man that I believe that God put in our favor was General Smith. H.D. Smith. Don't forget that name. It's very important. Number 2 was the man at the most critical time, that I was able to meet for the first time. And I said to him, I said, you have been given this assignment by President Ford to be able to help get key Vietnamese and Americans out of the country. Yes. I said, I have a list of names that I'd like to have you consider. How many are on that list? I said, only 175. And he went like this. And he said, you know, Dr. Watts, I've been approved by the president to authorize 15 or 20 at the max. I don't have the authority to do this. I said, well, Mr. Johnson, who do I turn to? Who do we talk to? The embassy is not doing anything for us. I said, you have to do something. He says, I can't take care of it now. You need to come back and see me later. I said, when? He said, tomorrow. What time? Tomorrow afternoon. He gave me the time. That man's name was Johnson. Johnny Johnson. Most of you have never met him. Some of you know him. I was on the phone with him last night. He's in his late 80s. He lives in Alabama. We have been in contact. We have stayed in contact for 40 years. Can you believe that? Johnson and I have stayed in contact for 40 years. It's difficult for me to tell you how much I love this man. I love him because he interceded in our behalf. And last night as we visited, he got all choked up. He couldn't talk. His voice was shaking just like mine is right now. I could see the tears running down his eyes. He said, Dr. Watts, oh, I just wish that I was well enough I could be with you tomorrow with your people. He said, oh, I just wish that I could be with you. But he's going through a health issue right now. He's fighting cancer. He says, I can't make it. But I'm sending my son and my daughter to represent me. And Edgar and Sandy are here today. Edgar and Sandy, would you stand? We want to pay tribute to you and to your father. They came down from the Bay Area to represent their dad today. I had a nice visit with them a few moments ago. It was an emotional visit for the three of us. And I've told Johnny, the first time I met him after the evacuation, I didn't have a chance to see him in that last hour, those last hours or two. But Pastor Yao and I had a meeting with him in Pasadena shortly after the fall of Saigon. We met together. I put my arms around him and I said, Johnny, I want to tell you something that you never thought about. You were God's man at the right time, at the right place to intervene and help our people. You are God's man. And I told him last night, as I could hear his voice shaking, I said, Johnny, God used you. You were an agent of God. And I said, it would not have happened if it hadn't been for you. And the reason for it is that he had such a strong conviction in his heart that something needed to be done for the employees of the Adventist Church, our leaders of the Adventist Church. He believed that. And he fought for us. He pled for us. And he said, we have a moral obligation to do something for these people. Now, he didn't have to do that. But you know what? I believe God put it in his heart. Don't you? God put it in his heart. The third man I'm going to talk about this afternoon was the man that made it possible for all of us that were in Guam to get off the island of Guam. Would you like to know how that happened? One man One man had the courage to make an important decision, and he made it. And we were privileged to get all 410 of our people off of Vietnam at one time. Fly into Camp Pendleton, buses up to Loma Linda, and there is where we were taken care of. That man's name is Henshaw, Dr. Henshaw. He was the president of Loma Linda Medical Center. And he was the one that said, bring them over. Loma Linda will take care of them. We'll wrap our arms around them, and we will sponsor them. Isn't that wonderful? We'll talk about that this afternoon a bit. This afternoon, come on up, Pastor, come on up. This afternoon, I'm going to share with you the passage of Scripture that I used with Pastor Yao translating for me. The last worship that I had in Vietnam on a Wednesday morning was at the little chapel in the Saigon Adventist Hospital. You remember that? And our employees, church employees, mission employees, hospital employees gathered there. And it was my opportunity to have worship because I was leaving on Wednesday to go back, as I told my wife, to go back to Singapore. So they asked me to have the worship, and I want to just share with you that little passage that I read this morning, and I'll talk about it more this afternoon. But it's a passage found in 2 Corinthians. And Ralph, you recognize this passage. But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that all surpassing power is from God and not from us. We are hard pressed, what does it say? On every side, but not crushed. Now, were we hard pressed at that time? Absolutely. But not in despair. Persecuted, but not abandoned. Struck down, but not destroyed. That was the passage that I used for the worship talk this morning. I said, we don't know. We're pressed down, we're crushed, we're perplexed, we don't know where to go, we don't know where to turn. But remember what God said to us in the book of Jeremiah. Behold, I am the Lord, the God of all mankind. Is there anything, what? Too hard for me? This afternoon we will finish the story.